Get bangs, they said. They'll be so cute, they said. Why did no one tell me they will become the bane of my lockdown existence? Okay, hello everyone, my name is Jess and welcome to Jess in Romancelandia, where I talk about happily ever afters and love stories and all of that delicious goodness. It's Pride Month, so happy Pride Month to everyone out there, and in honour of this month I thought I would make a video discussing my top 10 favourite romances. Originally I was going to make a more general video discussing my LGBTQ+ romance recs across the board, so including FF romance or romance with trans or aro or ace protagonists, but I realised that when it comes to the books that I have read within this subgenre, a lot of them are largely because they're what I see when I enter the Kindle store and this particular subgenre category. I think it's really interesting how within LGBTQ+ romance, is the predominant genre, and whilst I would like to think that sexism and marketability don't have as much to do with it, I do wonder whether they do contribute to the comparative lack of FF stories, for example. That being said, as someone that identifies as a bisexual woman, any form of LGBTQ+ romance, whoever the protagonist is really important to me, because just seeing anyone find their home within this community is something that just fills me with such joy and comfort in a way. So I think that there is value across all subcategories of LGBTQ+ romance. However, because I didn't really want to make a video where I recommend like 8 romances and then 2 FF and then 1 or 2 that have like trans or aro or ace protagonists, I thought that it would be best to focus on this specific subcategory so that it doesn't overpower the others, and then I can make separate videos at a later stage focusing on those subcategories of LGBTQ+ romance. So you can look forward to those videos at a later date, but until then, of course, I am always on the lookout for more LGBTQ+ romance recommendations, so if you have any, please do leave them below. So getting into the recommendations, I actually found it really hard to narrow it down to just 10 favourites, because even though you could argue that romance is a subgenre, within that there's also historicals and paranormals and contemporaries. So I decided to have my 10 main picks and then also 3 honourable mentions, which are what I'm going to start with right now. So my first honourable mention is a book that I think for many people is kind of a gateway book into discovering romance, as the 2 authors are such giants in MF contemporary romance, and that is Him by Serena Bowen and Elle Kennedy. This is a new adult friends to lovers hockey romance that manages to be both completely authentic and genuine and deeply romantic, so it's a wonderful place to start with reading romance. My next honourable mention is The Truth Within by Sloane Kennedy, and this is the 3rd book in her Pelican Bay series, although all 3 can be read as standalones. This book follows a new sheriff who arrives in town and strikes up a romance with a young man who is facing emotional and physical abuse at the hands of his deeply religious family. It is one of the very few romance books to make me uncontrollably sob, and it's just wonderful if you're looking for something with a lot of heart and a lot of really, really beautiful emotion to it. And the final honourable mention, until I get into my slightly more detailed recommendations, is Want Me by Neve Wilder. This is a new adult college set romance about 2 bisexual roommates who decide to explore their sexuality through a friends with benefits relationship, and it is one of the most earthy and unabashed explorations of sexual discovery that I've read, so this is also a really, really great one and I would recommend it. Okay, on to the main list of recommendations. The first book I'm going to talk about is Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reed. This is the 2nd book in the Game Changers series, which are all gay hockey romances. However, they can all be read as standalones, as they're not so much a series as they are loosely interconnected stories set within the same wider world of hockey. This is a hate to love romance that spans about 10 years and focuses on famous hockey rivals Ilya Rozanov and Shane Hollander. These 2 have been rivals since their rookie years on their respective teams, but they've also been battling a very intense pull towards each other since very early in the beginning. Heated Rivalry goes on to explore how these 2 negotiate their own blossoming relationship within the wider context of a hockey world that not only doesn't think they're gay, but doesn't think that they're anything more than the bitterest of rivals. Rachel Reed is a wonderful author. She is so great at imbuing emotion in the simplest of sentences and phrases, and she just does such a good job at illustrating these 2 separate characters. They're very different. Ilya is very like brash and outspoken, whereas Shane is kind of much more sensible and withdrawn almost. But when they come together, there is so much heat and rivalry, as the title might suggest, and it's just unbelievably rewarding to read, so I would highly, highly recommend this. For the next recommendation on my list, we're taking a turn towards historical romance with A Seditious Affair by KJ Charles. Again, this is the second book within a series, within the Society of Gentlemen series. KJ Charles writes a lot of LGBTQ+ romance, specifically historical romance set across varying periods from the Regency to the Victorian era to most recently, I believe, the 1920s, but this one remains my favourite so far. So the two main characters of this one are a radical bookseller and pamphleteer named Silas and a Tory politician named Dom. Dom, in an ironic contrast to his name, really yearns to be dominated, and that is how the two of them initially come together in a sexual relationship, but they end up finding their political discussions and debates deeply rewarding, and so romance kind of begins to tentatively blossom between them, despite the fact that they operate on completely different rungs of society and within completely different political realms. It's a romance that should absolutely not work, and yet the two men treat each other with such genuine respect and interest that it does. And whilst I would recommend any of KJ Charles's works, this remains my favourite for that very reason. My next recommendation on this list I threw in there just because it's so delightfully quirky and weird, and that is The Lightning Struck Heart by TJ Klune. TJ Klune in general is one of my favourite gay romance authors. I've mentioned his Bear, Otter and the Kids series multiple times on this channel, but this one I think is just so wonderfully unique that it's always going to be one of my favourite romances, because I don't think I'm ever going to read anything like it. So this is a parody comedic fantasy focusing on a young wizard's apprentice named Sam of Wilds, who must go on a quest to retrieve the prince of his kingdom, who also happens to be engaged to Sam's crush, the very dashing and immaculate Knight Ryan Foxheart. Whilst this story sounds like a very kind of typical fantasy setup, it's actually anything but. Sam's two psychics are a gay unicorn named Gary and a very emotional giant named Tiggy, and whilst the world operates in kind of that typical pseudo-European medieval world, they use modern language and phrases. I think two of the ones that come up in the book are fuck my life and DILF, so that kind of tells you a lot about the sort of language that is being used throughout this book. It's also one of the funniest books I've ever read. TJ Klune has humour that is like a little bit dirty, a little bit cheeky, focuses a lot on puns and just rudeness, but it had me like cackling the whole way through, and I would also really, really recommend the audiobook of this one if you guys are an audiobook fan. Just don't listen to it in public, because you'll get some really weird looks in the supermarkets when you just start like laughing hysterically. The next recommendation I have for you is actually a trilogy, and that is the Captive Prince trilogy by C.S. Picard. I have done a full review of this trilogy, which I will link below, and if you have seen that review, you will know that Captive Prince trilogy is one of my favourite series of all time. It follows Daemon of Achealos, who is the prince of a kind of pseudo-Greek kingdom. After the death of Daemon's father, Daemon's half-brother stages a coup and ships Daemon across to the enemy kingdom of Vir, disguised as a sex slave to the Prince of Vir, Lauron. As I mentioned in my original review, this trilogy is just a master when it comes to perspective. The characters that you think you are right to absolutely despise end up to have all these layers to them that make them impossible to hate, and the romance that develops between our two mains is the slow burn to end all slow burns, and is one of the most emotionally rich and rewarding love stories I've ever read, so it's safe to say that this is a favourite of mine. The next recommendation is very different tonally. It is a British romantic comedy called Rule Breaker by Lily Morton. Lily Morton is just one of my favourite rom-com authors. She got her start in MF fiction, but now writes almost exclusively romantic comedies, and all of her books have such heart and such delightfully British humour that I just eat them up right away. My favourite book of hers is also the one that is probably her most popular, Rule Breaker, and it follows Dylan, who has this very snarky, very banter characterised relationship with his boss, Gabe. Dylan has long since decided that his crush on Gabe, who kind of only ever has casual relationships and doesn't really commit to anything, is just going to stay that, a crush. But over the course of the book, these two men find themselves really drawn to each other. If I could sum this book up in one word, it would be charming. It is just charm personified, from the first person perspective of Dylan, who is delightfully cheeky and snarky, to the kind of icy exterior of Gabe. It's just pitch perfect, and I would really recommend this to any rom-com lover out there. Next up on this list is not a very original recommendation, but I had to recommend it as it is one of my favourite books of this year, and that is Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. Red, White and Royal Blue follows the fictional first son of the United States as he has to fabricate a media friendship with the Prince of England that slowly develops into a genuine friendship and maybe more. Casey McQuiston just writes such pitch-perfect dialogue and internal monologues, and she really has this wonderful writing style that perfectly encapsulates the kind of Tumblr-esque almost comedy of today. Her 21-year-olds sound like snarky, sarcastic 21-year-olds, and I love it. But what I love even more is the fact that whilst on surface level this is just a very cute rom-com, it also looks deeper into the political systems of the UK and the USA and at how they're perpetuating silence surrounding sexuality. And it presents this really lovely vision of what the future could be like if everyone was just a little bit more accepting. So I think it is a wonderful, wonderful read for Pride Month. Next on this list is somewhat of a classic within the romance genre, and that is Hothead by Damon Suede. I was really hesitant to read Hothead despite knowing how much people love it because the synopsis just sounded quite strange to me. So it follows Griffin Weir, who was a firefighter during 9/11 alongside his best friend Dante. Griffin has had feelings for Dante for years, but he represses them quite heavily, knowing that it probably wouldn't be accepted within their community or within their workspace. But he is no longer able to avoid his feelings when Dante approaches him and asks Griffin to perform some pornographic scenes with him for a sex website called Hothead. I was really hesitant to read this one because I just wasn't sure how Damon Suede was going to write such a fabricated situation as acting in porn and make it romantic, yet he manages to do it extremely well. You are always aware that whilst these two are acting up for the cameras, there is a genuine deep current of emotion underneath it. And beyond that, the mediation on how so many men and women within the services have felt the need to cover up their sexuality is a very emotional one to read about, and I absolutely loved it. I love Dante and Griffin, and I'll definitely reread this book many, many times to come. Next up on this list, we're turning back to historical romance with Kidnapped by the Pirate by Kira Andrews. I knew I wanted to read this book as soon as I read Kira Andrews' description of it, which was a gay tribute to the bodice rippers of the 1980s. She speaks in her story notes about how she really wanted to hit some of those classic tropes of the kind of 80s bodice rippers, you know, pirates, virgin, marriage of convenience, and just make it into a narrative that fully embraces the LGBTQ+ community. And just from hearing that, I was sold. So this book follows a young man named Nathaniel who is being shipped off to a colony to marry a woman he has never met at the behest of his father. Nathaniel is very aware of his own sexuality. He has only ever been interested in men romantically or sexually, but he also knows that there is no way that either his father or wider society would accept this, so he's kept it quiet and has kind of resigned himself to his fate. On the overseas journey to this colony, however, their ship is overtaken by pirates led by Captain Hawk, who decides to take Nathaniel hostage as a form of revenge on his father, with whom Captain Hawk has a very long and dark history. This book is just, and there is no other word for it, swashbuckling. My swashes were thoroughly buckled reading this book. I loved it. It's deeply romantic, it is sexy, it is infused with really interesting historical detail, and I would highly recommend this one. This is my favourite of Kira Andrews' books. Next up on the list we have True Colours by Anita Sunday. Anita Sunday is probably better known for her Signs of Love series, which is a series of romantic comedies based around the zodiac signs, but True Colours remains my favourite one of hers, despite being a more angsty and emotional read. So True Colours follows Marco and Oscar, who are childhood best friends that fell out after Oscar said and did something that deeply betrayed Marco's trust and scarred his self-esteem for years to come. Following said event, Marco essentially cut Oscar out of his life for years, which which was made easier by the fact that Oscar moved away for university. But at the start of this novel, Oscar is back and Marco is forced to engage with him as they are both involved in the plays that his father puts on annually to honour the death of Marco's mother. This book is a deeply emotional read. Marco has very severe burns covering his skin as a result of the accident that killed his mother, and his self-esteem and self-image is something that he grapples with throughout the entire book. And watching his journey to self-acceptance of his body, of his feelings for Oscar, of his situation, was just so rewarding to read. The unresolved sexual tension between Oscar and Marco just like crackles between them from the second that Oscar appears, and I was rooting so hard for them to get together from the very beginning. So yeah, whilst Anita Sunday is definitely known for her lighter works, I'd really recommend this one. It packs an emotional punch, but it is so very worth it. And the final recommendation I have on this list is Heatstroke by Tessa Bailey. Tessa Bailey is definitely primarily known as a MF romance author. She only has 2 MM romances in her entire romance arsenal, and Heatstroke is my favourite book of hers overall. I think it is a wonderfully, wonderfully written story. This book is the second book in her Beach Kingdom series, which revolves around the 3 Prince brothers as they attempt to run a beach bar during the busy summer months. The protagonists of this one are the middle brother, Jamie Prince, and Marcus O'Shaughnessy, a lifeguard and bouncer at the bar where Jamie bartends. Whereas Jamie has completely embraced his identity as a gay man following a horrific act of violence against him a few years before the start of the series, Marcus is definitely buckling under the weight of expectations and toxic masculinity. He comes from a male-only household and he has never really felt able to explore his sexuality. Despite this, from the second that Marcus meets Jamie, he is following the man around like an adoring puppy and is absolutely fascinated by everything that Jamie does and says. Despite Jamie's vow that he will never go back into the closet for anyone, he is really endeared by Marcus and Marcus's utter authenticity of self, and the two of them kind of embark on this really tentative but beautiful romance that is just so lovely to read. My favourite thing about the story is how well Tessa Bailey delves into the individual perspectives of these characters. Jamie is very intelligent, very organised, very diligent, and Marcus is essentially the human personification of a golden retriever, and she conveys that so well despite relying on third-person narration throughout. It's a wonderfully romantic story about the discovery and acceptance of sexuality, and I would highly, highly recommend this one if you've never picked it up. Okay, so those are all the recommendations I have for you. If you have any recommendations of MM romance or of LGBTQ+ romance in general, please do leave them below. I really, really want to read more of it. For me, reading LGBTQ+ romance was a way to explore and come to terms with my own sexuality, so I really value it as a subgenre and always adore delving back into it. So any recommendations that you can offer will be much appreciated. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, happy Pride, and goodbye!